So the network is open, so anybody can join the network, really. What we offer, to summarize, is help you finding collaborations from academia, civil society or industry, offer funding to develop and deliver your collaborative research projects, as well as access to tools for community and public engagements. But we also ask you something from you, and what we are asking is for you to join us within ethic of reciprocation, sharing, contributing ideas for collaborative research that can make a difference and embrace our open source approach. Okay, I'd like to welcome to the mic our keynote speaker, Lina Dencik. I hope I'm pronouncing that not as good as I could. Sorry for that. Who's gonna talk to us about advancing social justice in an age of datafication. Lina is a co-founder of Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University, and I had the pleasure of being down there last summer for a conference, which was a very exciting event, bringing together many people with a passion for social justice and technology. She has written several articles and books, most recently Digital Citizenship in a Datafied Society, and her current project, funded by the ERC starting grants, is Data Justice, Understanding Datafication in relation to social justice. Thanks, Lina.
Thanks. Thanks very much, and also thank you very much for inviting me. It does sound like we are on the same page on a lot of things that we think are important. And I think what I'll do in this talk, I was asked to talk a little bit about the Data Justice Lab and sort of where that idea came from. So I'll talk a bit about the rationale behind setting that up, which I think speaks to a lot of the concerns that Clara already outlined. And then I'll talk a little bit about a recent project that we just finished, which looked at particularly on the use of data analytics and predictive analytics within public services in the UK. And so we'll talk a bit about, we literally just published a report from that in December, and talk a little bit about some of the challenges we found both with doing that project, which might be challenges that I guess we'll face also for this network a bit, but then also what we think came out of that in terms of key issues to think about in terms of how we approach this issue of the relationship between social justice and technology, or perhaps how do we privilege social justice concerns in these discussions, which I think there are lots of different sort of entry points you can take into that, and so I'll also advocate for certain entry points that I think are important in that respect. So just a little bit about the Data Justice Lab. So this is currently the team that we have. Wow, that's small. Okay, but it's myself and Arne Hinsen, Joanna Redden, and Emiliano Trere who are sort of running the lab, I guess, and then we are really lucky to have lots of nice researchers. I can see Fika has become invisible on this slide for some reason, but there is also a picture of her there. But we're sort of a growing team of PhD researchers, postdocs, and research assistants, and working across a number of different projects. But the way that we were set up is we launched officially 2 years ago, roughly, but we had sort of had the idea of setting it up before that. And I think from a sort of disciplinary point of view, it's probably important to note that we're situated within the School of Journalism, Media and Culture, meaning we're all sort of from a media studies background, and that's very much influences how we approach this topic. So we're social scientists predominantly. And actually, you know, the idea of setting this up was really just because we were a group of, or a couple of people who were working on similar issues, and we thought, let's try and bring this together. And so we work across a number of different projects. So Clara mentioned the one that I'm working on predominantly, which is this ERC starting grant called Data Justice. But then with the others, I'm also working on a number of different ones. So the ones that we just finished is this one on that we've called sort of data scores, or citizen scoring, which is this idea of using predictive analytics in public services that we just completed. Then we've also done some work on policies, and the kinds of policies that exist but are also perhaps needed in this kind of data economy. And then my colleague Joanna Redden has this really interesting data harms record that she's created, which is on our website, which is a record of illustrations or examples, really, of the different ways in which we can think about harms that derive from data systems, which is a kind of ongoing thing, collecting, different examples, and you're welcome to also contribute your own stories to that. And then we've just started a new one, which actually focuses, I think, a lot on some of the ambitions of this network as well, which is trying to think about how we insert civic participation or intervention, citizen interventions, into the implementation of these types of systems, particularly in the public sector and in public services, which is something that we found doing this is very limited at the moment in terms of how we actually can, advance citizen voice, if you like, in these spaces. And then what we try and do, so the conference that Claire mentioned that we had last May was trying to bring together scholars, but also practitioners and civil society groups who are interested in this broad theme of data justice, as we're talking about. But we also try and do a lot is try and actually work with stakeholders, work with practitioners in workshops and in other kind of fora to try and get a sense of not only developments, but also try and bring different people together who are currently quite disconnected, which I'll go on to say is one of the ambitions of setting up the Data Justice Lab was to try and bring together communities who are currently sort of not really connecting in their concerns. And then just finally, because we are in a journalism school, and we're not, the people at the Data Justice Lab are not part of the sort of journalism program at the school, but Cardiff University is famous for its journalism school and has a lot of sort of journalism people who train future journalists. And we kind of try and take advantage of that by inserting some of the things that we think are important about how you report or investigate on these types of developments and how we can then include that into journalism education. Because one of the things that we think is really lacking is proper reporting on algorithmic decision-making, if you like, and holding that to account. So how do we try and use some of these skills that we have as social scientists also in journalism education? Because I think some of those are transferable skills. So we try and also think about that. And we've also developed some tools that we think will be helpful for journalists in reporting on some of these, or investigating some of these types of developments. So that's the Data Justice Lab. A little bit of background as to how we came to this idea of data justice and why we wanted to set up this project. So the book that was mentioned that we've just published is actually based on a project that we did, which looked at, and this also explains a bit of where we're coming from. So I worked with Arne Hintz and Carmel Jorgensen and some others on this project that was particularly concerned with the implications of the Snowden leaks and the revelations of digital surveillance programs. So that's kind of sort of initially how we came to this topic. What we were interested in particular was what does this mean for our understanding of citizenship, and particularly this idea of digital citizenship, which had been talked about a lot in recognition of the fact that the way in which we engage with society as citizens is increasingly digitally mediated in one way or another. But often that's been talked about in a kind of quite simplistic way in which citizens use digital tools to influence decisions that govern their lives. So this kind of very active way of understanding digital citizenship. But what the Snowden leaks revealed and made quite clear is that that's too limited an understanding of the relationship between citizens and digital technologies. And actually, we're not just acting as citizens by using digital tools, we're also made citizens by the way in which data is collected on us, and we're then sorted, categorized, and profiled in different ways that influence our ability to participate in society in certain ways. So we're also made citizens through our engagement with these digital technologies. So we wanted in this book to try and grapple with that kind of shift in understanding of digital citizenship that the Snowden leaks really revealed. So in many ways, we understand the Snowden leaks as a kind of moment, if you like, a historical juncture in our understanding of the relationship between citizenship and digital technologies that complicates some of the previous understandings of that relationship. And I think, so just to mention briefly and to also explain a bit what I think is important to think about, the Snowden leaks are important also for highlighting that the way in which we need to think about some of the implications of these technologies is kind of very much rooted in a broader, it's not just how to say this, that it's not just actually about a technological development. What the Snow Leaks made clear is that we're dealing with a very particular political economy of digital media, and this particular political economy has huge implications for how we're also governed as citizens. That relationship became very clear with the Snow Leaks because it was because of a particular business model of our digital media. All the platforms that Klaus showed before are driven by what's increasingly referred to as surveillance capitalism and accumulation logic based on mass data collection in order to gain revenue and market control. It's this particular political economy that underpinned the kind of surveillance programs that were revealed in the Snowden leaks, that underpins then also how we are governed. And that's important, I think, for understanding that we're always dealing with a broader kind of systemic issue as well, right? So when we're talking about these things. And the other thing that it made very clear was the extent to which data collection has now become part of our everyday lives, because the kind of data that was collected and was at the root of the surveillance programs that Snowden revealed are kind of everyday, routine, mundane data, if you like, activities, right? And this is kind of incorporated into these surveillance programs. And so what we're moved away from is, so David Lyons, the surveillance studies scholar, has said that we've moved away from a sort of idea of a surveillance state or surveillance society where it's an actor watching above us, and really into surveillance culture, where being seen through data in one way or another has kind of become a way of life. And it also shapes our mentalities and our practices and our engagement with society, right? So really much more entrenched understanding of how these technologies are influencing our lives. And the Snowden leaks made that very clear. And so just to mention, what we did with this project was look at sort of policy reform that came out of the Snowden leaks, but also media coverage, also technology shifts, so debates within technical standards bodies. But then the thing that I looked at particularly was what we broadly described as the civil society stream, which was really sort of public attitudes and knowledge, and then also attitudes amongst political activists, and in this case, political activists who are not directly engaged with digital or technology issues, so not digital rights groups or technology activists, but what we might think of as sort of social justice activists. So labor activists, community activists, anti-discrimination activists, environmental activists, anti-war activists, and try to ask them how did these ideas around mass data collection manifest themselves in their understanding of what they're doing, right? And I think just to highlight a couple of things from that, because that's really what provided the rationale for setting up the Data Justice Lab for us. And one was that what we found was that although there was this kind of idea that people don't care about these types of things, that this was not the case, people do care, but what we found is that people feel overwhelmingly disempowered to do much about it. So what we found is, so others have also described, there's a kind of sociology of digital resignation. So people feel worried about a lack of control about the information that's gathered on them. They have privacy concerns. All of these types of worries are there, but overwhelmingly it's like, well, what can you do about it anyway? There isn't really much we can do. I talked about it as a kind of surveillance realism, which sort of actually borrows from Mark Fisher, who wrote about in the wake of the financial crisis about capitalist realism, that even though we're sort of after the financial crisis, we're confronted with all the fallacies and inequalities and injustices of the system, we somehow don't have the imagination to imagine an alternative. And actually in the aftermath of the Snowden leaks, I think particularly in the UK, we were kind of faced with the same dilemma where lots of people felt this isn't right, this doesn't feel right, this is invasive, this is all of these things, but can't really imagine an alternative, seeing it as an inevitability that all of this data is collected and used in different ways. And there isn't much we can do. And I think that provides a challenge for us in moving forward in advancing social justice in the age of datafication, is really at the level also of imagination. How do we imagine alternatives in a way that we think is more just? But then the other important thing was that when we spoke to political activists about some of these issues, we found that actually they expected that this type of stuff happens, that surveillance goes on and things like this, but didn't necessarily see data and digital surveillance as a concern of theirs. So kind of outsource that to digital rights groups, to technology activists as something that they're concerned with, we're doing something else. And as I go on to talk, so what we identified was a kind of disconnect, if you like, between technology activists and digital rights activists on the one hand and social justice activists on the other. And very much the sort of initially the reason for setting up something like Data Justice Lab was to try and bring this together to illustrate that actually these types of developments are really important for social justice concerns more broadly. It isn't just a concern for digital rights and technology activists, and actually this discussion around what happens with these types of developments can't be confined just to those types of groups, right? That we need to really bridge these communities, and that's very much the notion of data justice for us, is precisely to bring together these types of concerns. And this is important because as we have sort of moved on, we were looked initially at the snow leaks, but now of course we've become familiar with the fact that actually this logic of mass collection of data, mass use of data, algorithmic decision making, understanding people through these types of technologies and making decisions about them on that basis is a logic that we see across lots and lots of our social lives now. So whether that's in terms of our ability to cross borders, the nature of our work, etc., or even if we go to prison or not, or even if our children get removed from our families and things like this, right? These are really very important aspects of our lives that now are imbued with these technologies and this kind of logic, which suggests that this really is an issue that lots more people need to engage with in this way. So this is just to sort of highlight that we have now, I mean, Virginia Eubanks talks about a regime of data analytics emerging in public services. Right? So I think there are lots of things that we need to grapple with in that respect. So therefore, it changes our understanding of what is at stake. Because what we found in the immediate aftermath of something like the snow leaks is that we had a sort of dominant framing emerge about what is at stake with this datafied society. And what we saw predominantly also in media coverage and in public debate is that the issue is one in which we have advanced efficiency, enhanced security, particularly state security on the one hand, and the concern that we need to grapple with is implications for individual privacy or the protection of personal data. That was often the sort of binary that we were given. Often people spoke of it as a kind of trade-off between these types of different things. But I think we've moved beyond that, and a network like this very much speaks to the fact that this is too limited a framing for understanding what is actually at stake. And we've had a host of literature in recent years in particular that have highlighted far broader social justice issues, if you like, to do with the fact that actually these systems are also part of undermining democratic process and questions of accountability and where decision-making takes place and the black box nature of decision-making that comes with using these types of technologies. We have had discussions that illustrate the extent to which these technologies are part of entrenching or advancing inequality or forms of discrimination, either through historically skewed data sets or through the algorithmic process itself and the variables and the way in which they're weighted. Or also, just in, for example, in the We Are Data book, about the extent to which the idea of an algorithmic identity is a very reductionist view of who we are and our lived experiences. And all of this kind of work really illustrates that requires a broader framing that really situates social justice more broadly at the heart of these discussions, far beyond just a concern with protection of personal data or individual privacy, that it touches on far more issues. So that is kind of the rationale behind this idea of the Data Justice Lab, is to try and engage with it in these broader social justice terms and engage with these developments and foregrounding those types of concerns. So I'll just talk a little bit about this project that we did, which was looking at uses of data analytics by government and local authorities in the UK. And what we did was also, we had interviews with public officials, practitioners within different local authorities, and also with civil society groups. And this is an approach we take to a lot of this sort of stuff that we need to understand, and this is a key thing that I want to stress, is that in order to understand the social justice issues around a lot of these developments, we need to understand them in their situated context. And that means that our entry point can't just be the technology itself. And I really feel that very strongly, that actually what we have in a lot of these discussions around, fairness and transparency and things like that is a kind of idea that we can isolate technology and just look at the data system in order to understand, issues of injustice without understanding far broader social and political issues and the context in which these types of systems are applied. And I think we need to have that in order to actually really grapple with some of the broader social justice issues that emerge from the applications of or the implementation of these technologies in certain settings. But we also then combine this with FOI requests, and we also did, and we have a tool there on this data scores. This is the kind of investigation tool that we created, where we try to help journalists and other researchers, and maybe some of you will find this a useful resource as well, where you can search what we scraped all government websites for mentions of keywords that are associated with predictive analytics. And then we have this database that you can search according to local authorities and things like this. I'll talk about it briefly. But this was something that we were quite keen to do, to try and sort of map some of these developments using also computational methods. But just as a key thing, just want to say, so we did something like 423 FOI requests across all local authorities in the UK to ask about their uses of data analytics. And what I think is very important, and a key challenge for some of this, is the fact that actually there's no comprehensive overview or list or anything like that about what is actually going on. And often local authorities don't know what other local authorities are doing, and government doesn't know. I mean, I spoke to someone from the Office for AI and said we were doing this and scraping their websites, and she said, great, then we'll know what's going on. I mean, I think that's quite, an interesting situation, and one of the key things that we need to push for is, I think, is much more transparency about what is actually happening. But what was interesting from our FOI request is there also isn't a shared understanding of what it means to be using data analytics. So in many of our responses, we had, no, we don't use any of that, right? Which I think indicates that people in local authorities don't necessarily know what it means to use predictive analytics. Whereas in other local authorities, we had very detailed lists of the kinds of systems that are being implemented and used. So there isn't, we really lack a shared understanding of what it even means to use predictive analytics in public services amongst local authorities. But yeah, there's the report that you can look at more in detail, some of these things. And this is just to show the tool. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can go on that and have a look and see, play around with it if you like. What we try to do is create some sort of overview of things that are happening, developments that are happening according to the companies that are being contracted, but also you can search according to local authority or according to sector. You can also just do a basic document search, so using keywords or phrase to see if it appears in any of the documents that are in the database. And then we have some case studies, which I'll spend some time on now. So we also then try to do some of these more in-depth case studies where we actually interviewed practitioners about their uses of data analytics in various different ways. And these were the ones that we ended up with. We tried to have some geographical spread, some sort of spread in the types of use. So fraud detection was a key area we wanted to look at, child welfare was another, and then policing was a third. So we tried to look across these different areas. And I'll just mention two of them across, so child welfare and policing. So the Bristol's Integrated Analytical Hub and the Avon and Somerset's police use of ClickSense. So just to give you a sense of the kind of things that we're talking about. So in Bristol, for example, what they have done is that in response to the Troubled Families program, which I think no longer runs in the same way, they set up, which is about having an integrated view of families. What they set up was a Think Family database, which essentially integrates all the different data sets across the council into one database in order to give a sort of holistic view of a household, which is kind of what a lot of local authorities are striving to do. So this is creating what they describe as sort of a data warehouse in some ways that they can use to get a more integrated sense of things that are happening within their local authority, within the council. So that's this is the list of the data sets. The report is online and you can see all of this stuff in more detail there. But what they're doing then in Bristol as well is that off the back of this data warehouse, what they wanted to do is create a predictive model as well that can predict what they describe as child exploitation. So the vulnerability of children. And that's based on using traits from previous victims of abuse or exploitation, and then matching that with existing families that they have in their database to sort of identify similarities and produce a kind of risk score, which is actually a numerical percentage score, right? That then social workers are given to inform their interactions with with this family. And so this is the type of thing that we're seeing happening. Now, what's interesting about Bristol is that they decided to keep it in-house, so it's developed by a data scientist within Bristol Council, which is not necessarily what's happening elsewhere, where people buy in more and more systems, these types of risk assessments from private companies, which creates a whole other kind of issue. But this is the type of developments that we're seeing, right? So this idea of scoring, family scoring, child exploitation, and vulnerability. And the other case study is the ClickSense one, which is in policing and what's sort of described as predictive policing often. But essentially, this is also where you produce both, so they use it for kind of neighborhood mapping, so trying to map what neighborhoods are likely to have crime, more crime, higher levels of crime. But what they also do is do individual profiling of offenders and provide them with a risk score, so the risk of reoffending, right? Based again on lots of different data, including some demographic data that informs the kind of score that offenders will then get. So that's everybody who's on the police database is given some kind of score for the likelihood of reoffending. And that informs then the decisions about their engagement, where they might put police officers, how they might engage with people that they have on that list, and so forth. So again, just to give you a sense that these are the types of developments that we're talking about. So this is the kind of thing we mean when we're talking about scoring. How much time do I have? Sorry. Okay, fine. So just to say, yeah. I'll give you quickly just some I think important things to draw from these case studies. What we found interesting, so what we said is that actually most local authorities will try and emphasize this idea of sharing data across the local authorities and create these kind of data warehouses. But what we found interesting is that every case study we looked at, austerity was the driving force, if you like, for the reason why they had implemented these technologies. And I think so Dan McQuillan has this great sort of phrase where he says, in order to understand the implementation of these types of technologies, we have a kind of dialectic context of data-rich and resource-poor context. And really that's the driving force for these types of technologies, which I think also showcases the kind of logic and in some ways, the difficulties in also having some kind of broader discussion about these types of technologies, because this is a way in which local authorities are trying to deal with a severe cut in resources. And I think it's also very interesting then for how they get used, because it does suggest that even though they might capture more risk, they don't have any resources to act on it, right? So you get a kind of strange situation and frustration in many ways going on. But also we've said that there are no actual standard practices around data implementation and use, so there isn't kind of a sense in which what is the appropriate way to audit or implement or use these systems. This is very different from one local authority to another. And we also have a kind of a mix of systems that are either developed in-house or are outsourced or brought in by private suppliers. But essentially, what we have is a kind of move to try and have a single view of citizens or at household level that can then be used to try and detect fraud, to try and use it then for predictive analytics that can be at both individual and population level. And the kind of scores that we're talking about is either sort of identity verification, so that's particularly in the case of fraud detection. They try and sort of match that, is this the same person that said they were living in this place, the same person that said was living in another place, or these types of things. So they do kind of a matching score. Or it's this kind of risk assessment and individual sort of profiling, if you like. Those are the types of scoring mechanisms that are emerging, public services. And the kinds of things that people were talking about in interviews was an emphasis that even though they're implementing these systems, professional judgment will always win the day, right? This was emphasized a lot in interviews, that actually, of course, at the end of the day, this is only to support decision-making, to inform decision-making, but it's up to the social worker or the police officer to use their professional judgment in order to make sense of what action is appropriate. And I'll come on to, because we obviously spoke with civil society organizations and we spoke with the British Association for Social Workers, and I think in practice, this is why I think it's important to understand these types of things in context, because in practice we have some questions about the ability for people to actually exercise professional judgment in the face of these technologies, right? And that kind of negotiation is always going to be a source of tension and will inform how these systems can get used. But the kinds of concerns that was often raised was mainly to do with data quality, so the quality of data and information input that local authorities are having to rely on, not being particularly good or accurate or standardized particularly well, and that creates a lot of problems for them. And the kind of auditing that they would do would mainly be about the technology itself and error rates within the technology. And also auditing kind of how much the system gets used amongst its frontline staff. Any kind of broader auditing mechanisms about impact or any of these kinds of things was not really done, in part because they don't have the resources to do it, but also they don't necessarily know how to do it. So we had no kind of impact assessment about how might this impact on, even if it's particularly a good practice to have prediction as a way of informing your action, right? Like these types of things were not really ever assessed, and also a lack of transparency and consent, in the sense that we didn't find a kind of that people had necessarily, that there were some particularly transparent communication about the fact that people's data was used in this way. And also we asked about the extent to which they had consulted with citizens before implementing these systems, and very little of that, right, as well. And this is important because then when we spoke to what we might think of stakeholder groups in civil society, so groups who actually work with impacted communities or service users and so forth, they expressed quite a lot of concern with the use of these types of technologies in these different contexts. So at a basic level, there was a concern about the extent of data collection and sharing that's actually being carried out. So how much data is being collected on us. But then also these kind of concerns that we've had before around bias and discrimination, the potential for bias and discrimination in these systems. And then also the extent to which this often will lead to targeting or stigma and stereotyping certain people. Once you get labeled as a risk within a system, how that then follows you around in your engagements in lots of different other services or in society in general, and what that actually does to people, and when people start feeling targeted in this way. And there was concern about the extent to which there was a lack of consent, and informed consent particularly, so people actually really understanding what they're even consenting to when this data is collected on them, and oversight mechanisms, but also that any kind of data protection regulation isn't going to address the broader politics of this. So actually a lot of these people we spoke with from civil society felt that these systems are really being implemented to advance a certain agenda that isn't about the technology, but is about trying to change public services in a kind of broader policy way, right? So I think, and again, this highlights that when we're talking about social justice in this space, looking just at the technology isn't going to give you very much. You have to sort of situate it in the broader sort of political culture and agenda that we are dealing with in order to really understand these types of issues. So the kinds of discussion points that I feel came out of this project for us, and that we're kind of very keen to talk to also with local authorities about and have a broader public debate about is, we can accept that data is necessary for public services, but what data is necessary to collect to improve public services? What role should this idea of scoring have in decision making? How much should it inform decision making, these types of things? How can we enhance transparency? What is appropriate? Because in part, they also didn't want to have too much transparency because of particularly in something like fraud detection, because of the risk of gaming the system and these types of concerns, but also because they can't reveal commercial sensitive information about how their model works, which is the business model for some of these suppliers of these technologies. How should data systems be audited? And I think this is a key question. Is it really enough to look at these very sort of narrow definitions of accuracy rates, right? I think that's something, or should we have a broader understanding of what auditing means that also has something to do with kind of democratic accountability? And then how should impact be assessed? And here I think there's a real question about the extent to which there's a disconnect. What we saw obviously in our research was a disconnect between practitioners and developers and then people who work with impacted communities. So how do we bridge that and actually incorporate experiences that people have of when these types of systems get used for decision making into our understanding of impact as well. So it's not just about privacy impact, but broader understanding of social impact. And then what are implications of these public-private partnerships that are being created through the implementations of these systems? And then what are actual avenues for civil society and citizen voice, which is something that we're now trying to work on and identify, and also use practices from elsewhere in Europe where actually that we have more citizen participation in some implementation of some of these systems. So to try and also think about that. So I think that there are, also I think there are broader questions that came out about what it actually does to our understanding of what public services are, the idea of the welfare state. Does that get augmented with some of these use of some of these systems? So for example, the extent to which, and this is something that we're quite interested in thinking about, the extent to which it sort of personalizes risk in very particular ways. When you start understanding risk in this kind of individual household level, how much does it move social policy, for example, and our understanding of welfare away from broader structural issues to do with, for example, poverty or inequality, and towards this kind of individualized household level understanding, personalized understanding of risk, where you are responsible for the fact that you are a risky person rather than any kind of broader social issues, right? I think that's a broader kind of question that we're also faced with. What do these technologies do to our broader understanding of public services, right? Does it change it fundamentally? Which were also some of the concerns, I think, that came out in our civil society discussion. So this, again, is kind of this broader picture of where does this fit in these broader developments. So just to finish now, I think this might get unnecessarily abstract, but I think what can a sort of justice approach bring? The way that we're thinking about this idea of data justice is really to understand not the justice of the technology, but how does data play out in a kind of social and economic justice agenda. So rather than taking the entry point through the data system itself, it's actually taking the broader sort of social justice concern. So for example, in this case that we looked at, we can think of it in terms of a welfare rights agenda. And how do data systems impact on that ability to, pursue welfare rights? Which is, the other thing we did was work with the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Extreme Rights, who came to the UK in November. I don't know if you remember, who wrote a very damning report on the impact of austerity in the UK. Well, he also came to visit us to talk about how are these implementations of these types of systems relating to those kinds of issues, right? So to think of it in this kind of integrated way. And this is just kind of, generally speaking, we can see how actually the use of these technologies, development of these technologies impacts in kind of fundamental ways some very basic notions of justice that we have also from sort of social justice literature, because social justice relies in many ways on our capability to reason with each other and so forth. And in a kind of meta way, these systems also influence how we understand what the social world is and our understanding of people. So it impacts on our notion of reasoning in a very sort of abstract way, but it also impacts on core issues around representation, recognition, the idea of difference through this augmentation of identities into algorithmic processes, this idea of the notion that you can abstract social relations into data points that can then be processed, does something fundamental to how we're recognized and seen in society that speak to fundamental justice concerns, right? So just to think about it in that way. And then finally, just to say that the way that we think we need to approach this, it's about sort of broadening the entry point and perspective. So thinking about the institutional settings that we're looking at, where these data systems are being deployed, what are the organizational practices, how do data practices relate to other social practices and in organizational settings, and then making sure that we're always engaging with the communities who are being impacted by this and making that the sort of perspective and entry point into what is happening and connecting concerns between those who are concerned with technology issues, but with those who are concerned with these broader social justice issues. And I'll finish it there. That's okay. Thank you.